Officer Luke Bennett's crash report already listed Alyssa Grant failed to yield when her dashcam finished loading on my evidence tablet. On the video, Connor Reeves's pickup entered the intersection after his light had turned red. Sergeant Mark Reeves stood behind Luke, watched the same footage and said, "Don't upload that yet. We don't know if the timestamp is reliable." I was a civilian traffic evidence technician with the Linden Falls Police Department. I photographed serious crash scenes, preserved video, documented vehicle positions, and maintained the evidence trail officers later relied on when they decided fault or filed charges. I did not decide who was guilty. I did know when evidence contradicted a report. About 10 minutes earlier, I had arrived at Carver Avenue and 4th Street to find Alyssa's older compact car angled near the entrance of Pinecrest Fuel. The passenger side was badly damaged, while Connor's pickup sat farther across the intersection with much less visible damage. Alyssa, a young black woman wearing a denim jacket over a university sweatshirt, had a small cut on one arm. She kept asking whether her passenger was all right. Jasmine Reed was sitting near the open passenger door, holding one shoulder while paramedics checked her. Connor was standing beside his truck. He was more interested in the front bumper. "You pulled out in front of me," he told Alyssa. "I had the green light." Connor looked at her car, then back at her. "You even have insurance on that thing?" Alyssa did not answer the insult. "My dashcam recorded the light." Connor's eyes moved immediately toward the windshield. That was the first thing about him I noticed. Not surprise, calculation. By the time Luke arrived as the assigned patrol officer, Sergeant Reeves was already there in civilian clothes. His badge was clipped to his belt. I assumed he had heard the collision over department radio. Then I watched him walk straight past Alyssa and Jasmine and put a hand on Connor's shoulder. He checked his truck before speaking to anyone else. Luke was in his first year on patrol. Mark had been a sergeant longer than Luke had been out of high school, and I could see it whenever Luke glanced at him before riding. "Truck had the right of way," Mark said. Alyssa turned toward him. "No, it didn't." Mark barely looked at her. "Officer Bennett will sort that out." Except Mark kept telling Luke what to write. When Alyssa offered the dashcam, Mark called the collision straightforward. He suggested there was no reason to complicate the report with video that had not been authenticated. That was when I asked Luke quietly, "Why is Sergeant Reeves involved in this one?" Luke glanced toward Connor. "That's his son." I looked at Mark again. The entire scene changed, without anyone moving. Alyssa gave me permission to copy the dashcam file, and I loaded it directly into the evidence system. The timestamp matched the crash time, and the footage showed her entering on green while Connor's truck crossed the stop line after his signal had already changed. I entered the file before anyone could tell me to wait. Video evidence offered before preliminary fault determination. Then I added another note. Potential related party conflict Sergeant Reeves, identified as parent of involved driver. Mark saw me typing. "We're still working the scene, Miles. I'm logging evidence." He looked toward Alyssa's car and walked over to it. "I need to inspect the interior." Alyssa stepped between him and the rear door without touching him. "I don't consent to a search. It's a safety inspection." "You're off duty." Mark's expression tightened. He reached for his radio. "We may need another unit. She's becoming uncooperative." Jasmine's phone was pointed toward him from inside the car. I saw the recording indicator. Alyssa did too, but she said nothing about it. Instead, she stepped several yards away and made a phone call. "Dad, I'm okay. Jasmine's hurt, but she's awake. The other driver ran the red. His father is a sergeant, and he's involved in the report." She listened. "My dash cam is already preserved." A few minutes later, 2 Virginia State Police vehicles pulled into Pinecrest Fuel. A man in a dark weekend jacket stepped from the second vehicle. Luke straightened immediately. I recognized him from a statewide evidence procedure briefing. Superintendent Charles Grant, Alyssa's father. He checked his daughter and Jasmine first, then contacted Chief Karen Whitlock. He did not touch Luke's report. He did not ask me for the dash cam. He did not give anyone an order about Connor. I'm an involved parent, he said. I will not participate in the fault determination. Mark Reeves was still standing beside his son's truck. Charles Grant remained beside his daughter. Both men carried badges. Only one of them understood that being a father meant stepping out of the investigation, not taking control of it. Chief Karen Whitlock arrived before the second ambulance left Pinecrest Fuel, and the first thing she did was separate the people who had authority from the people who had personal interests. Sergeant Mark Reeves was told he could remain because his son was involved in the collision, but he could no longer speak with Luke Bennett about the crash report, approach Alyssa's vehicle, or direct anyone collecting evidence. Superintendent Charles Grant stayed with Alyssa until the paramedics finished, then moved outside the working area without touching a report, a camera file, or an enforcement decision. Once Mark stepped out of the chain, Luke began asking Connor the questions Alyssa had already answered. License, insurance, phone use, his route before the crash, whether he had been looking at the screen in his hand while approaching Carver Avenue. Connor's confidence changed when the process became symmetrical. The evidence changed even faster. Alyssa's dashcam already showed Connor's truck entering the intersection against the red signal. The exterior camera from Pinecrest Fuel gave us a second angle. Because I had requested preservation before the station could overwrite the file, we received the full sequence instead of a short convenience store clip. That footage showed the truck crossing the stop line after Alyssa had already entered on green. Jasmine's phone supplied something different. It did not prove who caused the collision. It proved what happened afterward. Her recording captured Connor invoking his father's position and Mark discouraging Luke from documenting the dashcam. It also showed Mark reaching for Alyssa's car after she refused consent, and Luke looking back toward the sergeant before continuing the preliminary report. Captain Renee Foster from Professional Standards opened the administrative review the next morning. Because I had handled the digital evidence, I sat through the reconstruction with the original files, upload times, and report history displayed in front of us. The sequence was difficult to argue with. Luke entered Alyssa Grant, failed to yield before viewing the dashcam. I uploaded the contradictory video afterward. Mark told us not to rely on it yet. I entered the related party conflict flag. Charles Grant arrived later. That final timestamp mattered because it removed the easiest excuse anyone could have used. The evidence supporting Alyssa was already preserved before her father appeared. Renee interviewed Luke separately. She later read the relevant portion of his statement during the evidence review. He admitted Mark had described the collision to him before he interviewed both drivers fully. He admitted he knew Mark was Connor's father. He also admitted he left Alyssa's offered dashcam out of the first draft. Mark had told him the crash looked straightforward. I knew I should have documented it, Luke said. I didn't want to challenge a sergeant at his son's accident. Renee wrote the sentence down exactly as he said it. My own interview was not much easier. She asked, when I learned Connor was Mark's son, I gave her the timestamp from the conflict entry. Then she asked why I had kept working quietly. I hadn't immediately told Luke the draft process needed to stop. I'm a civilian technician, I said. I thought the scene decisions belonged to sworn personnel. Did evidence integrity belong to you? Yes. I knew where she was going before she asked the next question. Then, when did your responsibility begin? I did not have a better answer. The timestamp was already on the screen. Mark's defense was controlled. He said he had arrived as a father, not as an investigator. He said any advice to Luke came from experience, not an attempt to protect Connor. Renee did not argue with him. She played Jasmine's recording. Mark could be heard directing the report and dismissing the offered video. He called Alyssa uncooperative only after she refused access to her car. Then, Renee compared his treatment of the two drivers. Connor's ownership was never questioned. His truck was not searched. Nobody treated his refusal to admit fault as a behavior problem. Alyssa's license was examined repeatedly, and her ownership was questioned. Her vehicle drew immediate suspicion, and a lawful refusal became a reason to call for additional support. The review then expanded, but only in one direction. Renee searched previous incidents involving Connor. She looked for times when Mark had contacted the department, showed up at a scene, or communicated with officers handling the matter. Several files surfaced: a minor collision, a road rage complaint, a late-night disturbance. In each case, Connor contacted his father, Mark entered the process, and the final documentation became less serious than the initial complaint suggested. No secret conspiracy appeared. The department had simply never created a rule requiring an officer to step away when a family member was involved. At the end of the session, Renee placed 2 timestamps beside each other. Mark Reeves enters investigation before independent evidence review. Charles Grant declares conflict before taking investigative action. Then she opened Luke's revision history. One father's involvement had already begun changing the record. The other had made sure the record stayed out of his hands. Captain Renee Foster's final report separated the collision itself from the conduct that followed. Only one of those questions required traffic reconstruction. Connor Reeves had entered the intersection against a red light. He struck Alyssa Grant's vehicle after she already had the right-of-way. The preliminary failed-to-yield entry attached to Alyssa was removed. The official crash record was corrected, and the insurance findings reflected the same sequence shown by her dashcam and the Pinecrest fuel camera. Connor faced the consequences of his own driving rather than the consequences his father had tried to prevent. His license was suspended through the normal review process. He was cited for the red light violation and reckless driving supported by the evidence, and he became financially responsible for the vehicle damage and documented medical costs connected to the collision. His false account of the crash was also referred separately for review because investigators had evidence showing he knew the light sequence before giving his statement. Mark Reeves's case was different. Professional standards found that he had entered an investigation involving his own son while off duty, displayed his badge, used his rank to influence a first-year officer, discouraged the preservation of evidence that contradicted Connor, and attempted to gain access to Alyssa's vehicle after she clearly refused consent. The earlier Connor-related files made the finding harder to describe as one emotional mistake by a father. Mark had repeatedly inserted himself into matters involving his son, and each time the department had treated his experience and rank as reasons to listen rather than reasons to examine the conflict. He was removed from duty during the investigation and later terminated after the administrative process concluded. His certification was referred to the state licensing authority, while evidence concerning possible obstruction and official misconduct went to an independent prosecutor. Superintendent Charles Grant did not participate in those decisions. He gave a witness statement about what he observed after arriving at Pinecrest Fuel, disclosed his relationship to Alyssa in every formal record, and stayed outside the disciplinary process. That distinction became part of the final findings without anyone needing to turn it into a speech. Luke Bennett received discipline too. Renee concluded that Mark's pressure explained why the first-year officer hesitated, but it did not remove Luke's responsibility for beginning a report before reviewing available evidence and then leaving Alyssa's dashcam out of the first version. Luke remained employed under probation, completed ethics and escalation training, and was required to demonstrate that he could challenge a conflicted supervisor without treating rank as evidence. My own review was shorter. I had preserved the dashcam, secured the gas station footage, and placed the related party flag in the evidence system before Charles Grant arrived. I had also waited too long to say directly that the report process itself had become compromised. I kept my job. There was no promotion attached to preserving evidence that I had already been responsible for preserving. Linden Falls changed the process instead. Any officer whose spouse, child, parent, sibling, or household member became involved in an incident now had to disclose that relationship immediately and step outside the investigative chain unless an immediate life safety issue required action. A separate supervisor had to control the scene. If the department was too small to provide one, another agency could be requested. Evidence offered at the scene also received an automatic timestamp and could not be excluded from the case file because a supervisor considered the incident straightforward. Report revisions retained their original wording and editor history. Civilian technicians like me gained a direct supervisor conflict flag that went to command staff without passing through the supervisor being reported. Nearly a year later, I was photographing another collision in Linden Falls when a police lieutenant arrived and identified one of the drivers as his wife. He stopped at the edge of the working area. "That's my wife," he told the responding officer. The officer acknowledged it and contacted the independent supervisor required by policy. The lieutenant did not approach the report tablet. He did not question the other driver. He did not ask me what the camera showed. I collected a phone video from a witness, logged the file, and continued measuring the scene. The lieutenant waited beside the sidewalk, like any other family member. His badge stayed on his belt, and the report stayed out of his hands. This story is fictional.